welcome.
Hi, Leslie. Good to see you.
I'm going to be a little louder because I'm used to teaching in a classroom. Good morning. Thank you. Okay, what I'd like to do is to get us started. So I'm going to ask you to take your seats because we have great panels, and I know part of it is for you all to have some buzz among yourselves, but at the same time, we want to make sure you can do that during the lunchtime. So we want to try and get us started this morning. We have a great panel, and I heard that my colleague thought he was the token social scientist. Let me tell you, my colleagues at the law school don't treat us as tokens. So social scientists are integrated into some of the things that they do. So I'm very happy to be here. And it's my pleasure to moderate the panel on intersectionality by design, epistemologies, disciplines, and discourse. My name is Vicki Mays, and by training, I am a clinical psychologist who also has a background in health services research. Now, one of the things is that in the course of the development, the conversations that have occurred relative to this meeting, this panel really does come at a good time and a good place. For its job is really to ask some hard questions, to really celebrate some victories, but I think it's probably most importantly to give hope, direction, and maybe even the same type of clarity that we all found in Kim's 1989 article on how to capture, conduct, and transmit these complex intersectionality discussions of ours into some previous, that we've had previously, into meaningful analyses. Now, in the earlier days of the meeting, we've discussed probably that the most meaningful analyses there are those in which the parts of the frame are interlocking, that they're not merely the addition of the parts, and that also they're not always multiplicative. Yet for some of us, we have disciplines in which our tools of analysis say that our models is sometimes an either-or as opposed to a both. Our tools of analysis, particularly the quantitative ones, are designed to determine, for example, the contribution of race, then the contribution of gender, and then somebody says, now let's bring back in social economic status and start again. I mean, for those of you who are social scientists, you know what I'm talking about in terms of the model building and the approaches. Well, we often, as social scientists, also talk in terms of, well, how much variance was explained by that one variable? And we talk about, in the models, how significant is it? And we pick the things, and we like it. The more stories we have, the more we like it. Well, what happens, though, on the other side is that we put this in the world as science. And when we put it in the world of science, it is what is used in terms of the development of policy, the development of laws and procedures, and sometimes some among us do not understand the damage that we do to the people that we care about the most. Because for those of us who live the reality of complex identities, we sometimes watch prizes for work which sometimes has no real meaning in our lives, or the lives of the people for whom the very work is designed to help. It's like in the current healthcare reform, and I promise I'm not going to go too far on this. I promise you. But a major part of the debate, for example, is about access. And how much is it going to cost to let people have broad access to healthcare and healthcare services? Well, the problem is somebody forgot to remind them that for many people of color, despite giving me a policy that says now I can have access to health care services, that you forgot to include in the analysis all the other variables that probably are even more significant for whether I live or die. Such as, did you forget that you shut down the hospital nearest to me so that when I travel in an emergency, I'm in that dangerous zone of more than 30 minutes? Did you forget that while the state says you are required to provide me with an interpreter, that it's only luck whether or not that person is in that emergency vehicle, speaks the language, or if I can even find a primary care physician who speaks my language, especially if it is anything other than Spanish and English, and I'm even lucky if it's sometimes Spanish. Now, I could go on and on about the analyses of that, which is really designed to keep me healthy. But the problem is when it's too simple, or either the variables are not there, it kills me. And you blame me. What happens in terms is that you actually blame those of us who have complex lives. What you see is I, as a black woman, who despite having access to health care, had bad health outcomes for something I did because your tools of analysis incorrectly said you provided me with what you think would keep me alive. So if I died, if I got sicker, or if I now cost the system more money, I am the one who was wrong, not your tools of analysis. So I want each of you today, and for the rest of the time, particularly those of us on the panel, but also those of you in the audience, to know that each of you needs to help solve the dilemma of intersectionality going forward, because it really, really matters. Now, from several of you yesterday, the question was, how do we create the space to have our teaching and research not have each of us be only our parts and never come to like the sum of the parts in their context? I resonated to that as last Monday, and I shared this with Priscilla and a couple of others. Last Monday, I gave the last lecture in my class on health status and health behaviors of racial and ethnic populations. And that's the one where I bring all of the statuses together, such as race, social inclusion, economics, to explain health status. And for whatever reason, I could not understand as I was giving the lecture why the students of color were on the edge of their seat and there was so much commenting. You know, you like to feel, ooh, I'm doing it really great, but I knew there needed to be something after that. Well, what happened is the students and I stayed for about 30 minutes after class. And what they shared with me is what it felt like to be in a classroom where this has been discussed before, but only as the parts. It was stigma, it was shame, and it was never getting to what I call my last big lecture. And it really left me, though, with, which is why I'm really looking forward to this session, really left me with how can I lecture about statuses that are embodied in a bigger context and not wait to the end. See, I thought that giving each piece its just due was great and they just kind of knew, but I learned from the students, for example, the little remarks that were done outside of class, the places in which, you know, people then carried that and didn't realize, oh no, you have to come back for the rest and you have to wait till it's all put together. So the issue of these simultaneous embedding as our research tool, in our teaching, and as we walk through our disciplines is really a very salient issue for us to try and think about. The panel will discuss from disciplinary and epistemologic places. I knew I was going to stumble over that, but anyway. Successes and failures of having discourses about intersectionality or post-intersectionality. Each panelist provides us a case from which we can learn how to create and build the spaces that several of you have indicated that you want. It is in the examination of these successes and failures that we can learn how to advance the discourse. But also, what we must be prepared to accept is that, which, as it serves as a foundation, this discussion, for each discourse will more likely than not stay static. We have really struggled with that. It may not at a later point look as it began, but the question is, can we recognize it among us as our disciplines are different? One of the questions about the future of intersectionality, though some of you have already moved on to post-intersectionality, is what happens when it's transplanted into disciplines, some of whom still lack any kind of social justice framework, whose tools for success for those in the profession are built on these conservative narrowness that wins the prize of tenure, promotion, and prestige. What happens to the discourse about power, subordination, and social location when the tradition of a discipline is really homage to dead white men in order for it to be published in the mainstream of that discipline's journal, in order for it to be revered? This discussion is as much about transmitting and maintaining integrity and the complexity of intersectionality in our discipline as it is about creating, so that we will all recognize it later. Now, the panel has asked that I not spend time with long introductions, that instead I introduce them by name and we're going to do it by their discipline so that we can begin the dialogue. The way the panel will run this morning is that each of them will talk for about 15 minutes, and then the panel is going to spend some time on their similarities and differences in a few questions which will be posed by me, and then we will open it up for discussion. I will introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. Professor Leslie Hall, who is a sociologist, will start, followed by Professor Charles Mills, a philosopher, and lawyers Dean Spade and Francisco Valdez. Help me welcome them this morning.
Thank you very much, Vicki. Is this working? All right?
Yes.
So first let me thank Professor Kimberly Crenshaw and the other organizers for putting together what I think is truly an extraordinary and inspiring conference. It's been an absolute pleasure to spend the past couple days here and to hear the brilliant talks and questions and conversation that I've heard. But let me also say that I was impressed even before I came. We were given a very beautifully written and very thought-provoking memo to prepare us for this panel. And even though it was just a little more than a half a page, it really distilled, I think, the central questions that a panel like this one should address. A panel, as I think of it, as sort of discourses, academic discourses of intersectionality. And since it was written on a page, even though it wasn't published, and even though it was just 2 weeks ago, I'm going to engage already in an active translation of that memo. And I'm going to respond to a couple of the sentences, the phrases that were in that memo as a way to frame the issue of intersectionality in the social sciences. So although the memo didn't pose it this way, I'm going to pose one of the questions in that memo as a kind of multiple choice question. And the question was, is it more helpful to think about intersectionality as A, a research agenda, B, a theoretical frame, C, a social dynamic, D, a basis for a singular methodology, or E, I'm adding this, all of the above. And I might even actually add a sixth category that was left out but was very much a part of the overall description, which might be praxis. Is it a praxis? So I would love to get everyone's answers to this question, but we don't have time for that. And I'm going to tell you what my answer is. So my answer is that it's first C, a social dynamic, and then B, a theoretical frame. And I think that Professor Crenshaw was probably careful in not calling it a theory and instead calling it a theoretical frame. And I think I would agree with that. And then D, I think it is a kind of method, maybe not necessarily a methodology, but in a very narrow sense, and very technical sense, a method. Let me just say a few words about what I think it is not, and I'm really open to. I think people are going to probably disagree with this as much as they'll agree, if not more, with what I'm going to say. So this is all very provisional. So with that caveat, let me say what I don't think it's a research agenda, and the reason why I say that is because I think research agendas are about what's interesting and important to you as a researcher, as an activist, as an advocate. And I would never want to circumscribe that. I very much agree with what Cheryl Harris said yesterday, which is theory always comes later. It always comes after the research. It comes after the experience. It comes after a problem that you've encountered and that you have a sort of urgency to figure out. And I think that's how research agendas are developed, and I think that there are so many different possibilities for how we do research that it's essentially a creative process that I wouldn't want to see people feeling constrained that they have to work under a particular framework. Okay, so let me get into going through these one by one. First to talk about intersectionality as a method, then as a social dynamic, and then as a theoretical frame. And I'm going to provide examples of each of these as we go along, because examples have been, as I'm sure all of you are aware, extremely helpful in clarifying what intersectionality means from Kimberly Crenshaw's work, and of course all of the important antecedents to that work as well. Okay, first, as a method. So again, going back to the pre-conference materials, there's a sentence in a description of a planned post-conference publication that literally haunted me for days after I read it. I mean, it just jumped off the page at me, and it's really the only thing I remembered for several days afterwards. And the description states that the publication will focus on anti-subordination intellectual or political projects, and then says that, quote, on this point, while we recognize wide-ranging interpretations and applications of the concept of intersectionality, we are intentionally prioritizing those which do not reduce intersectionality solely to, quote, a method of classification, unquote, or, this is the best one, quote, a designation of coinciding demographics, unquote. A designation of coinciding demographics. And that makes it sound so uninteresting. And I thought to myself, you know, I cringed. I thought, you know, what do we social scientists do? We suck the life out of everything that is fascinating and vibrant and important, and we use this word demographics. I mean, what could seem more depoliticizing than that term? You know, we take a set of variables, race, income, gender, sexuality, education, we interact them, outcomes, a bunch of intersectional categories defined by the data set, every possible political, policy, health, as Vicki referred to and others have referred to, family, political, legal outcomes, any of a multitude of outcomes can be analyzed for a gazillion different groups defined in this way. So I have to confess that, in fact, many of us in the social sciences are concerned about just this sort of intersectional approach and its proliferation in recent years. To the extent that intersectionality is becoming a common term in, quote, mainstream social science literature, I think it's just in this way, as a justification to separate out gender, class, race, and other groups for empirical analysis. Someone might call this, and I would call this, the intersectionality hypothesis. And it's becoming nearly ubiquitous, especially in submissions to the main gender and racial studies journals in the social scientists. And as long as the analysis focuses on a small number of groups and does an adequate job of empirical analysis, it will be published. And even in the top mainstream journals are now publishing this kind of research. And I think the impulse behind it, in most cases, is really a very good one. It's to challenge generalizations based on dominant groups or average patterns, and to expose and document experiences that are in need of political and policy, and for this audience, legal attention. And this approach, in its best incarnation, is about getting the facts right, and about defining what differences are and when differences matter. And so I'd like to suggest, in a very minimalistic vein, that with all of its problems and potential problems, this is a sort of very minimalist method of intersectionality in the social sciences. However, having said that, there are many, many people who do intersectional research of this kind, yet do not call it intersectional research, and maybe wouldn't even look kindly upon their research being called intersectional research. And I think that this is a potential issue, problem that we should think seriously about. So having said that, I want to move on to a second way, I think a richer way perhaps, of talking about what intersectionality is, and that suggests that we might want something else, something more from an intersectional analysis. So if the first definition of method is about getting the facts right, I would suggest that the second definition is that we want to think of an intersectional approach as one that leads to potentially different interpretations of the same fact or set of facts. So certainly it's not the intersection of categories that makes it intersectional, but the social dynamics, and then I'll talk in the next section about the theoretical framing that informs the analysis and especially the interpretation. So let me just give one example from the research of Professor Avril Clark, who's a sociologist at Yale University. As an assistant professor there, she's written an incredibly courageous new book, which I don't think is out yet, and it's called Love Inequalities. Has anyone heard of this, by the way, in the audience? So look for it. It's forthcoming from Duke University Press. So let me say the title again, Love Inequalities. And she's a sociologist trained as a demographer. And if it's not clear to you already, let me tell you that this is not exactly the kind of title that wins you accolades in the social sciences. And the fact under dispute in Professor Clark's work is the low fertility rate of college-educated black women. Now, economists interpret this fertility rate as low relative to the high fertility rate of non-college educated black women. And economists celebrate this lower fertility rate as a sign. There are many ways in which they might celebrate it, but let me tell you how they state that they celebrate it, as a sign of economic rationality. Exactly the kind of rational economic behavior that you would expect from college-educated women who want to maximize their future earnings. However, Avril Clark examines the same fact, and she's a demographer. She does it in demographic as well as qualitative terms, and she comes to a different conclusion than utility maximization. She compares black college-educated women's fertility to white college-educated women's fertility, not to black non-college-educated women's fertility, and finds it to be absolutely much lower. Black women's college-educated black women's fertility is much lower in an absolute sense to white women's college-educated fertility, even though both groups have the same level of education. Further, drawing on her interviews with college-educated black women, she finds that such a low rate is not necessarily what black college-educated women desire. She goes on to situate this pattern within the context of constraints on black women's love relationships as a result of dynamics in both the black and white communities, including racial prejudice and stigma against black women's sexuality and segregation by both class and race, both residential and social segregation. So in this way, the broader social dynamics of racial, gender, sexual, class inequality are central to Clark's explanation of the same fact that economists interpret and celebrate as economic rationality. Now, one can object to academic and policy attention to this obsession with black women's fertility, and Clark does do that. But Clark doesn't simply challenge current explanations. She makes a very strong case that love inequalities are as important or as central to our notion of inequalities as the other kinds of dimensions of inequalities that we typically focus on. And that's why I think it's a very, in many respects, very courageous book. Okay, let me skip to, that's about social dynamics and the interpretation, different interpretations of social facts depending upon the broader social dynamics that one considers. Now let me talk about how a theoretical frame enters the picture and how this might uniquely define an intersectional approach. And let me take an example here from my own research that I'm doing now on the rich. The idea is to understand the rich in the same complexity as we understand the poor. And that's a joke, by the way. So to the extent, it's more complex than we know, than our analysis of the rich. Let me put it that way. So what I'm doing is I'm borrowing notions of social pathology and deservingness that is usually reserved to talk about the poor and applying it to the rich. And the difference here is that I developed the term of the undeserving rich. I normally do not get applause when I use that. I usually am so afraid that people are just going to turn off when I say that term. They're just going to switch off, and they don't want to hear anything else that I have to say. So, I mean, one of the aspects of this is that I try to develop it in a relational way. So the rich are undeserving, not just as a matter of fairness, in the sense that they earn much more than they should. And the vast majority of Americans, for years, for decades, I've looked at a lot of the public opinion polls of this going back to the 1970s. They do believe that the executives, for example, earn much, much more than they deserve. And this is a constant. It's only gone up, of course, in the past couple years. But I also argue that they're undeserving because their excesses are harmful to the rest of society. This is the relational part. This is a zero-sum relational analysis that's rarely discussed in public discourse. And my research suggests, as I've said, that the public is actually very much attuned to this interpretation, even if journalists and policymakers and politicians are not. So how is this an intersectional analysis? First, in it being explicitly relational, comparing and contrasting exclusively, not exclusively, but primarily white men at the top to people of all colors and genders in the middle at the bottom. But it's also intersectional in the sense that theory from racial, especially critical racial and gender studies and feminist studies, very much informs this work. And it informs it because a critical argument in that literature is that inequality of outcomes is an indicator of inequality of opportunity. And that may sound very mundane to you as legal scholars, but it's an incredibly important construction when applied to income inequality. And it's never applied to income inequality because the assumption is that Americans don't care about income inequality because they want opportunity. But once you turn that around and say, but wait, in fact, income inequality constrains opportunities. In the same way that racial and gender discrimination law says that outcomes are an indication of discrimination and limitations in opportunity. Once you do that, you can see that Americans do care about income inequality, and they don't tolerate it. They see cracks in the facade of equal opportunity, and they care about its constraint on prosperity. So let me just conclude very quickly by saying that intersectionality is a method of classification, to be sure. It is a designation of coinciding demographics, to use that jazzy phrase. But more than this, it's a way of seeing the role of broad social dynamics and relationships as explanations of social life. And it's a way of theoretically framing and traveling, as Mari Matsuda talked about, the traveling of theory across disciplines and across fields. And in this way, I think it's probably the most interdisciplinary research practice that we have in the academy.
Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers and, of course, Kim in particular for the invitation. I look around and I know I'm not at a philosophy conference. Riddle, how do you know when you're not at a philosophy conference? Answer, there's more than one person of color present in the audience. So, let me begin by asking all people here with a philosophy background to raise their hands. Oh, there's more than I thought. Hey, I was going to... Alison, I didn't even see you. Okay, so... Okay, I was going to make some nasty cracks, but I'll tone those down a bit. I don't want things getting back to Northwestern, my department. Okay, so what I want to talk about is a huge gap between what you could think of as the potentiality of philosophy for discussing these issues and the actuality. And the potentiality arises out of the fact that philosophy is a discipline that's supposed to give you the big picture. And when I say the big picture, I don't just mean, what Chicago is like. I mean, like what the universe is like. So, is the world material or ideal? What is the nature of the good? What is truth? All this stuff. What is justice? And the great thing about it is that no empirical research is necessary. Sociologists, they have to, go down to the south side of Chicago. They're pretending to be gang members. They're years later, when they've exposed themselves, they find a hit has been taken out on them because of what they've revealed. Anthropologists, they're in the Australian outback. When philosophers do research, they basically just, go into the study, or even better, the bedroom, and they assume the position, which is basically this. And half an hour later, or for the really deep truths, 45 minutes later, you emerge and you're able to tell people, what truth, justice, and the world is like, with, as I say, no empirical constraints. And as you all know, especially you guys here in California, we're in a time of budget cutbacks, and deans and presidents are looking for ways to trim costs. We talk to the physicists, and I'm afraid that, accelerator you guys have planned on, cost $20 million, no luck with that. The chemistry people, no good. Philosophy and math are the cheap dates of the professions, because with mathematics, all you have to do is give the guy a pencil, a notepad, and a waste paper basket, and he's set. With philosophy, you don't even need the waste paper basket. So it's a wonderful profession, and I'm glad to be here, and I hope more people don't find out about it, in contradiction with what I earlier said, because as a racket, I don't want too many people getting in on it. Anyway, so let me talk a bit about the pretensions. Okay, so the idea is that this is a discipline that enables you to put everything into question. You're not pandering to the conventional wisdom, you're seeking wisdom. And the Western tradition, of course, the founding figure seen as Socrates, and he's famous for buttonholing strangers, on the streets of Athens and asking them embarrassing questions. What is truth? What is justice? Are you legal here? No, that's another question. So, truth and justice. And the climax of the story, of course, that he's actually executed. In other words, he's been such a successful troublemaker that they sort of give him the ultimate accolade and say, well, now, Socrates, you have to go. So there's this long, impressive tradition of philosopher and philosophy as shit disturber, the discipline that's challenging how we think about things, that's putting into question our basic categories, and that is trying to undermine the conventional view that we have of society, of the social order, and so forth. So that part of it is inspiring. And the getting executed part, maybe, can sort of pass by that. But, certainly, the idea that you're asking questions that challenge the conventional wisdom, that's really great. Okay, so the question then is, given this sort of inspirational origin, why is philosophy today so often completely remote from this attractive ideal? Why are more philosophers not present? Why is it that philosophy is not a sort of central presence in the whole interdisciplinary literature? What basically happened? So what I want to do is to identify what I think of as three crucial factors. There may be more, but I think these are three very important ones. First, abstraction. 2, McCarthyism, and 3, demography. Okay, so abstraction. Philosophy, by its very nature, is claiming to be studying universal and timeless truths. It is, for God's sake, a discipline which is still reading texts from 2,000 years ago. How many other disciplines can you say? How many other disciplines would you want to say that? And you're still, sort of taking off, the dusty old books, of Plato and Aristotle and so forth. So the idea is that you're reading this stuff that goes back all the way then, and in terms of timeless truths, race is not a timeless truth. As we all know, the conventional scholarly wisdom is that race is a product of the modern period, and as such, it really only becomes a factor in human affairs, in the structure of society in the past few hundred years or so. So there's the abstraction in the sense of atemporality, in the sense of ahistoricity, the idea that race is not really an appropriate philosophical topic. And a friend of mine who was on the planning committee of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association, philosophy is really weird in innumerable ways. If I had you here for hours, it would not be able to pin down all the ways. But one of them is that the APA, unlike all other professional academic organizations, is divided into 3. Anyway, so the Eastern Division is the most high-profile one, because of course that's the Northeastern Seaboard, that's the Ivy League schools. So they were planning the next APA Eastern meetings, and my friend, this black guy who shall be anonymous, of course, on the fact that I've mentioned he's black, it somewhat narrows it down, doesn't it? Anyway, so this black guy, I hope I haven't screwed him by this, who shall be anonymous, told me that he said to them, why don't we have a session on Charles Mills's work? A silence fell in the planning committee. And somebody said, you know, I've always thought of Mills as basically doing sociology. So the idea is, if you're working in these areas, that's not philosophically legitimate. So there's the abstraction as atemporality, as the ahistorical. But there's also, under this category, philosophy as dealing with the ideal. And that goes back to Plato, that goes back to this idea that you sort of distancing yourself from the body has appetites, you don't want those appetites things sort of interfering with abstractions, and you sort of ascend through the world of mathematics and conceptual abstraction to the world of the forms, and there you're just in a world of pure abstract concepts. So again, if you're distancing yourself from the body, how can you be talking about gender as philosophical? How can you be talking about race as philosophical? These are clearly not appropriate philosophical topics. So the very abstraction of the discipline is pretensions to discuss universal truths and truths of a sort of timeless and abstract and ideal character. That's going to militate against discussing these issues of race and gender. So that's the first point. So that point, I'm sure, will be one that's sort of familiar to many people in this room. If you've ever done an intro philosophy course and thought to yourself, oh God, never again, let me sort of sell my textbook, get something back before I go on to some more valid and worthwhile topic. Now, the second point I want to make may not be quite as familiar to you. I want to talk about McCarthyism. And there's a philosopher here at UCLA, except guess what? He's not in the philosophy department. He's in the German department, a guy called John McComber. And John has written, this was some years ago, so I think it was 10 years ago, a very interesting book called Time in the Ditch. And this book is a study of the impact of McCarthyism on professional philosophy. And what he basically argues that if you look at the statistics on a per capita basis, comparing philosophy with other disciplines, the number of people who lost their jobs because of McCarthyist harassment, because of the loyalty oath and the lists, on a per capita basis, higher than any other discipline. Just think of that. The same discipline I've just finished trashing, during the 50s under McCarthyism, more people lost their jobs through political harassment than in any other discipline. Why is that? Because, as I say, you have the legacy at that time period, coming out of, the pre-war period, the 30s and the 40s, the period of John Dewey, the idea of, pragmatism, the idea that philosophy should be practically engaged in the problems of the country. Philosophy should not be sort of this abstract, sort of floating above the clouds discipline. Philosophy should be on the ground, getting its hands dirty, doing useful stuff. And basically what happens is that you have a whole set of people, including people, refugees from Europe, refugees from Nazism, who have that kind of political background, and under the 50s, these people basically get a message. And the message is, you do this kind of stuff, you lose your job. And John argues that you get a shift in mainstream philosophy in what becomes hegemonic analytic philosophy, and that's a shift towards dealing with issues of logic and philosophy of language, and metaphysics in such a way that you detach yourself from the world. In other words, these are safe. You don't need to worry about the FBI coming and knocking on your door when you're doing your logic and philosophy of language. Social and political philosophy, that's another story. So he claims that to understand the sort of nature of professional philosophy today and what he calls the sort of supremely apolitical nature of the dominant strain, which is analytic philosophy, you can't attribute it purely to internal considerations. You have to look at this major external factor, McCarthyism in the 50s, and how it shapes the discipline, and how it shapes what comes to be seen as accepted philosophy, and the kind of things that you should be doing, and the kinds of things that you very much should not be doing. Okay, and then finally, the third factor, and for those of you who have heard me speak before, I sort of go on and on ad nauseam about this, the demography of the profession. Now, women, by which I basically mean white women, have made significant progress compared to, let's say, 20, 30 years ago. Roughly 20% of the profession are female. Now, of course, it's not equal representation in terms of who are full professors. It's not equal representation in terms of, the prestige schools in the top 10 or the top 20. It's not equal representation in terms of a sort of conceptual shaping of the discipline. Nonetheless, the situation of white women is certainly better than people of color. Because for people of color, and get ready for these stats, which people find hard to believe when I tell them, in the entire country, out of more than 10,000 professional philosophers, you have about 120 black philosophers. Now you're talking about 1%. So I personally, Charles Mills, I'm 1% of the black American philosophical population. So it means that when people are going to a conference on race, they can't travel on the same plane, because if that plane crashes, that's 10% of the black philosophical population wiped out right there. And even on my narrow and stooped shoulders, the burden rests of sort of keeping that 1% live. So I'm going to be very careful, going back to Chicago after this, sort of stepping on the bus and so forth. Okay, so 1% black, and if you add Asian Americans, if you add Latinos, if you add the 5 or 6 Native Americans, you get another 1%. This is a 98% white profession. So what does this mean? Well, it means when you go into the APA, when sort of, what you used to call the smoker in the days when people smoked, sort of in a social gathering after the conferences, it's the sea of whiteness. So, one's metaphors have to keep track with the times. And what I used to tell people when I give talks on philosophy, that I think of philosophy as something like Antarctica. It's this, giant, frozen, hostile, white continent on which a few figures of color are trying to make progress and being blown backwards by gale force winds. Of course, with global warming, that's why I say your metaphors have to keep track with the times. With global warming, I can't sort of use this image anymore because there are all these sort of brown and black spots in Antarctica now. So there's more progress being made in Antarctica than there is in professional philosophy. Okay, so now 3 minutes left. Well, you see, all that was preface, but I've just got the word that's 3 minutes left. So I'm going to have to bring this to a close, guys. Okay, so all of this then, Vicky had this line, which of course is a line that's very familiar to all of us, that you need to see that, in terms of dealing with these issues, it's not either or, but it's both. In philosophy, it's not either or, it's neither. Why? Because if gender is hardly legitimate, if race is beyond the pale, and I mean that metaphor, obviously in a literal sense, then how can you even talk about intersectionality when these original issues are not even on the table to begin with? So Vicky also mentioned about some people being in a post-intersectional phase. We are in a pre-intersectional phase. So philosophy has, various self-descriptions. One of my favorites is philosophy as the queen of the sciences. So basically the idea is that, philosophy is this, if you think of a kind of Victorian figure, somebody who's not amused, has an unimpressive train, ruling over everybody else. So all you guys are really under us. You may not have realized this, but as a queen of the sciences, this is not a sexy and interesting drag queen. This is, a boring, a Victorian queen, somebody who's like, 50 years behind the times. So it's going to be a long struggle. Anyway, let me rush quickly to the positive part, such as it is. Okay, so what's the central theme of philosophy? Well, going back to that same Plato I mentioned, Plato's Republic, seen by many people as the foundation stone of the Western philosophical tradition, central theme is justice, okay? So justice, well, you figure these issues of race and gender, class, sexual orientation, isn't that something to do with justice? We would therefore expect that philosophers were sort of upfront and central in dealings with justice. And in fact, in 1971, a book was published by a guy called John Rawls at Harvard, A Theory of Justice, and this book is generally given the credit for reviving political philosophy. So there's now an immense literature on justice. Literally thousands of articles, scores of books, conferences all over. And in this huge literature on justice, I hear you say, well, obviously, there are a huge amount of stuff on racial justice, gender justice. Think again. So we ask, well, conceptually, how is this possible? Aren't you talking about justice? Isn't gender subordination in justice? Isn't racial subordination in justice? It's very easy. Let me explain how it's done. Rawls says in this book that we should think of society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. Now think about that for a second. In the good old USA, country founded on Native American genocide and expropriation, African slavery, And we're going to think of the United States as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage. There seems to be something prima facie wrong with this picture. Nonetheless, this is how we should think of society. And he says he's also going to focus on a well-ordered society. What's a well-ordered society? A well-ordered society is a society of perfect justice. What is a society of perfect justice? A society of perfect justice is not a society where you've had injustices that have been corrected. It's a society that has had no injustice at all. So the promise of Rawlsianism, the promise of the revival, I have a sign that says end. Okay, so the promise of all this stuff has basically been conceptually foreclosed by framing issues of justice in such a way that race and gender, let alone any intersection of race and gender, are just conceptually sidelined from the get-go. So a few people are trying to make a change. Again, somebody from UCLA, not in philosophy, Carol Pateman, in the political science department, and Carol is the incoming president of the American Political Science Association. She has a famous book on gender, The Sexual Contract, inspired my own book, The Racial Contract. Not to be too crass, but I have in my hand the book we did together, available at all better bookstores, Contract and Domination. So this represents my attempt and sort of bring race and gender issues into political philosophy. And the basic idea is you don't start off from this absurd notion that society is a cooperative venture. You start off from the fact of social oppression. And you then ask yourself, in an oppressive society, what does justice demand of us? So this is what I'm trying to do in my small way to make philosophy a bit more representative and to live up to these vast pretensions it has. Thank you.
So I'm so glad to be here. Thanks so much to the organizers, and especially to Saul and Jamila and CT, who've done a lot of amazing organizing work that might be unsung. And I also just wanted to thank the CRS faculty. The CRS program didn't exist when I was a law student at UCLA, but all the people in that faculty gave me really the essential ideas and tools and support that I've needed to formulate the kind of politics that I'm interested in, and it was obviously life-changing. So I just wanted to say that. I also never use PowerPoint, but I have a tendency to speak really fast. I thought it might help. And I also want to say that in the interest of time, I'm not going to do the feminist citation practices that I want. But you all know where the ideas I'm talking about come from because we've been hearing about them all weekend, and so I ask you to be patient with me on that. It would take too long to list all the people I'm referring to. So I wanted to start with two quotes. This first one from Michel Foucault. It seems to me that the real political task in a society such as ours is to criticize the workings of institutions that appear to be both neutral and independent, to criticize and attack them in such a manner that political violence that has always exercised itself through them may be unmasked so that one can fight against them. If we want right away to define the profile and the formula of our future society without criticizing all the forms of political power that are exerted in our society, there is a risk that they reconstitute themselves. And the second one from Ivan Chernyavsky. Under the conditions of dominant governmentality, recourse to the law and to the determination of right functions generally as it has always functioned for those on the margins or the outside of bourgeois hegemony, functions, in other words, as a tactic, and no longer a preferred or privileged tactic in a world where anyone too insistent on the constitutive and normative properties of law looks vaguely sentimental and out of touch with the real politic of the day. So I also want to start with an example that I think will help illustrate some of the things I'm talking about. In recent years, there's thousands of examples to use for this. There's not a reason I'm picking this one. It just came to mind. In recent years, as immigration detention has rapidly increased in the United States, activists, including lawyers and law students, have sought to document and expose the abuses faced by detainees, often demanding the creation of procedures that would hopefully reduce long stays in detention and their attendant harms. The talking points of these advocates have sometimes included the assertion that detainees are not criminals, that they are in a civil detention system, and they are being deprived of even the basic rights afforded to people in the criminal detention system in the U.S. The implication is that, being non-criminals, immigration detainees deserve at least as much, if not more, protection and process than people in the criminal system. The analogy is concerning for at least three reasons. One, it suggests a deserving-undeserving framework that reifies the demonization of people targeted by the criminal punishment system. Two, it may intensify divisions within constituencies targeted by both immigration and criminal detention systems. And three, it participates in a fiction that the criminal punishment system is fair, that criminal defendants have enforceable rights, and that those fictions justify the existence and continued expansion of that system. These problems result, at least in part, from taking the law at face value, believing what it says about itself, that the criminal and immigration detention systems are two different things, that there are two different kinds of dangerous people captured by them, and that certain rights are guaranteed within each process. The result is a weak demand that the immigration detainees be given the kind of process that criminal detainees are given. Anybody who works in criminal defense knows how utterly not helpful that might be. Viewed through an understanding of law as a tactic of governance, in which we're invited to survey a broader field of conditions, we might see the sharp rise in both immigration and criminal detention as a feature of neoliberalism targeting racialized populations, and recognize that the deployment of racialized detention in the name of law enforcement always operates to mine and control certain populations marked as drains or threats at the population level, regardless of a window dressing articulated through individual culpability and individual rights. This analysis might be important to conceiving resistance. It might help avoid producing a demand that merely tinkers with the legal processes attendant to expanding detention, such that it gives that expansion further legitimacy, and it might invite a strategy for resisting detention that brings people vulnerable to the criminal detention system and people vulnerable to the immigration detention system into a shared struggle, rather than putting them at odds with each other and placing those individuals and populations targeted by both systems outside of the frame of intelligibility. So keeping this example in mind, I want to use my time to say a few things about some of the key analytical tools developed by critical trajectories like critical race theory, women of color feminism, critical disability studies, queer theory, queer of color critique, and Foucauldian theory that I think are helping shape an analysis of various resistant movements about various forms of governance. I want to suggest that some of the engagements that I'd like to see further developed. That was sort of the thing in the call I really picked up on. So these key critical trajectories give us a bunch of ways to think about, and this is sort of my shorthand way of thinking about it, why, in strategizing our resistance, we should not take what the law says about itself as true, and two, we shouldn't invest in getting the law to say good things rather than bad things about the vulnerable populations that we're a part of and care about. And that, of course, is all based on a broader understanding that was just mentioned of, our analysis that the legal system and the U.S. state itself are based in slavery and genocide, and that reforms of the legal system often legitimize those arrangements that are maintaining racialized gender control, including the racial wealth divide and the cyclical abandonment and detention of racialized gender communities. So part of what I think this kind of critical thinking does is it moves us away from just trying to change what the law says about various marginalized communities into a different set of questions. These are some of the other questions. One, how we come to understand ourselves as subjects of various legal regimes, how certain things come to be governed, how certain disciplinary and regulatory knowledges and practices congeal into institutional forms, how the nation state is co-constituted with regularized categories of identity, what relations produce and reproduce racialized gendered subjections, and how resistances can be conceived from within power relations that are never transparent or centralized. These critical trajectories have provided us with key critiques of the project of legal equality, especially, right, or the idea that we become human by becoming equal under the law. So some of these critiques of legal equality, I mean, this is just like the really quick and dirty, but you all know what these really are. Obviously, the critique that single vector analysis of subjection leaves out people with intersecting vulnerabilities, the central issue of this conference. The idea that legal equality projects individualize the problem. They make the problem about aberrant individuals who have bad intentions and ideas who we need to hunt down and punish for their racist or transphobic or whatever acts. And also that the legal regimes around them have made it impossible to ever prove that, so that it's very hard to actually avail yourself of discrimination law, for example. Also that these legal equality frameworks don't reach the actual conditions of subjection. They don't reach sort of the maldistribution of life chances, right, that are beyond the individual level. And that actually they often make those conditions of subjection and maldistribution appear neutral, because really the problem is those individual bad, aberrant actors. Obviously that dehistoricizes the entire context of racialized gendered subjection, and it legitimizes the existing distribution. It provides the window dressing, right? The state declaring, you're all equal, it's all good, when in reality we all know that the conditions of maldistribution and the racial wealth divide, et cetera, are worse than ever, right? And all of this, several scholars have talked about, what often happens is that the law transforms just enough to preserve the status quo in the face of massive resistance from marginalized people, right? So there's some real concerns about legal equality. And all of this to me also reminds us that when we lend towards the false universalities of the legal equality project, it's not just sort of like an incomplete project, oops, some people got left out, right? Actually, it stabilizes and worsens harmful conditions, right? Legal equality is a feature of the increasing disparity that is neoliberalism. That's part of my argument, right? And I can give you examples about sort of the gay marriage movement, about the attack on immigration reform that only focuses on making sure that same-sex partners can marry and immigrate, and then therefore would say the immigration system is now fair, or the decriminalization of sodomy is somehow making fair the criminal system, it's no longer homophobic, right? These sort of little tiny legal equality projects that actually justify the purported neutrality of the broader distribution. So I've looked at these critical analyses of equality projects next to the work of Michel Foucault, and especially his theorization of power, to see how we can come to understand governance, stateness, violence, and the production of various targeted populations. I'm going to give you all a very crude, and I apologize to Foucauldian scholars in the room, framing of Foucault, of what sort of Foucault gives us about different modes of power, and because I think that this framing is really useful for looking at how we might understand the role of law in our resistance projects, especially why we shouldn't believe what the law says about itself, and why we shouldn't expect that changing what the law says about us will change our lives, right? So Foucault describes these three modes of power. Sovereignty, which is based in the right to kill, primarily about killing individuals who challenge the power of the sovereign power. And in sovereignty, obedience to the law and the maintenance of the sovereign power is a key goal. He describes discipline. Discipline is about norms that are articulated at the individual level through institutions, right? Institutions like schools, medicine, prisons, family. He looks at these locations, sexuality, et cetera, and looks at norms that produce codes of behavior that we both enforce on ourselves and that are enforced on us, and that establish categories of types of individuals. So he looks at the famous example of the invention of the homosexual, right, which of course it meant the invention of the heterosexual. And so that these ways, these codes of behavior operate through the creation of sort of types of people, right? And then finally, he gives us biopolitics. Biopolitics is concerned with promoting the life of the population, right? And it's about the distribution of life chances. It operates at the population level, and that we look at population level interventions like social security programs, public health programs. And I also like to look at things like the war on terror or the war on drugs, programs that are at population level that mobilize many different administrative capacities of the state, everything from education policy to criminal justice policy to welfare policy, right? These kinds of modes of engaging at population level interventions are sort of what biopolitics is about. And biopolitics is not about the right to kill the sovereign. It's instead about the distribution of life chances that make certain populations live and let others die, right? So sort of the abandonment of populations. And one of the questions Foucault comes to is how can a mode of power that's concerned with making live, how can that mode of power include massacre, which we see right in the period in which he's saying this mode of power is very dominant. And of course, his answer to that is that state racism is inherent in biopolitics. And so state racism he describes as the production of the idea that certain populations are threats or drains that the main population needs protection of. So welfare queens, drug dealers, right? We can think, terrorists, right? All of these sort of, the production of those populations different in every era, but we know who they are in our era, of course. And that biopolitics is the kind of power that operates through producing regularities. So I think about this a lot in terms of the way the war on terror has heightened identity surveillance for all of us, right? So producing us all as data sets and making it impossible if you can't sort of survive the various matrices of data collection for you to live, right? So targeting, of course, undocumented people in a variety of ways. Sorry if that was too fast, but anyway, it's good stuff. You should look at it if it interests you. So Foucault tells us that biopolitics or governmentality is sort of the dominant mode of power today, or is an essential area that's often hidden, that often appears neutral, and that we rarely talk about. And that in the context of governmentality, law is a tactic, right? So even Chernyavsky mentioned this in the first slide. Right, and this is a quote where Foucault actually says that if you're interested in it. And so that in governmental analysis, we understand that there are multiple and competing aims, right? And that there's not internal consistency or coherence in what people might call the state or the government or the mode of governance. So what's interesting is that a lot of times we critical people just decry, whatever's going on because we say it's incoherent, it's inconsistent, right? But in reality, Foucault is saying, of course it is. It's decentralized, it has multiple aims, and law is one tactic in the arrangement of things, right? So there's sort of it's not a helpful charge to be like, this system is incoherent, because all of the systems that dominate and control are. So law reform projects, I think, often take up sovereign power, right? That we often think if we just change what the law says about ourselves, our lives will change because there's some kind of notion that there's obedience to the law. And that is something that I think is very limited, as we talked about in the limits of formal legal equality. Sometimes we take up disciplinary critiques, right? I think that more and more, however, what we need to be taking up is a critique that understands population levels of operations of power, especially in the context of neoliberalism, which is characterized by arrangements at the population level, such as the cyclical population level abandonment and detention that I mentioned, and that all facilitate the upward distribution of wealth. So examples in my field of study and trans politics, right? I'm not going to go into detail because I'm running out of time. There's a lot of disciplinary critiques that trans scholars and activists have taken up, especially the critique of the medicalization of trans identity, the ways in which doctors operate as gatekeepers, the way that medical standards are brought into law around trans people's well-being, and how that basically reduces our life chances. And also critiques of anti-trans feminism are another example of disciplinary critiques. What's more interesting that I think is emerging now, and that I would like to see more of, are critiques at the biopolitical level or regulatory critiques, right? So some examples of this are critiques of the administration of sex classification policies as part of identity surveillance tactics, right? So they just added gender to plane tickets, but we can look at the longer history of all the ways in which we come to have so many pieces of ID that have so many markers on them and how they operate to maintain and manage populations and produce threats and drains that can be let to die, right? And so looking at this, particularly in the context of the war on terror and increased identity surveillance, critiques that people have been engaging around sex segregation as a technology of control in detention systems, right, and in general in systems and spaces culturally and socially where people of color and low-income people are concentrated. I think that we also see this in the mobilization of feminist and anti-homophobic projects for politics for imperial projects. In this conference, we've heard about the use of, we're going to save women as a reason to engage in bombing Afghanistan, right? Or we hear that we need to bomb Iran in order to protect gay people, right? There's sort of these kinds of moments of cooptation that are, I think, taking up often a biopolitical framework of understanding militarization next to various sort of modes of population management. And also the critiques that we see of boutique prisons, right? The idea that we're going to create gender-responsive prisons in California, or we're going to create a trans prison, those kinds of ideas that we should use the critiques of feminist or anti-homophobic or anti-transphobic movements to actually further expand the prison project, right? So we need a biopolitical understanding so as not to be sort of duped into that, right? And certainly I think the critique of criminalization in general as a response to domestic violence and hate crimes. And then also I just want to mention specifically the critique of the nonprofit industrial complex, I think is a really, really good example of this, and it ties to me to my concluding points. And especially coming out of present abolitionists, women of color, feminists, and other radical spaces in the last few years, we've seen this critique of the nonprofit industrial complex or of the professionalizing of movement activism in the period post 1960s and 70s when we saw the criminalization of activism, right, and the liquidation and targeting of radical organizations. So we see this critique includes the idea that there's been a separation of services from organizing, that this professionalization has undermined and contained the radical potential of social justice work, and that policy and services are funded in depoliticized ways, but the actual organizing work that would bring demands that do more than just stabilize the status quo has fallen out and not gotten funded. The funders control and direct the work rather than affected communities. That the activism is professionalized, so that white people with educational privilege, et cetera, are in power. They're the ones making the most money off of it, et cetera. And that the entire thing helps rich people avoid tax liability and control what would be public funds, right? So that critique, which I'm sure many of you have read, the Insight anthology, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. If you haven't, it's really amazing. So given these critiques, and these are my concluding points, I think that the sort of combination of critical trajectories that I'm talking about have done a bunch of things to turn our attention away from expectations of legal equality, inclusion, and recognition projects, and have in fact made us suspicious of them. And I think that there are some key areas of development in these conversations that I'll just name here very briefly that I see emerging at the intersection of movements for prison abolition and end to immigration enforcement, radical racial justice, queer and trans politics, reproductive justice, racial and gender disability politics, et cetera. One is obviously an attention to the administrative realm, right? Moving out of just focusing on anti-discrimination law and sort of those areas where the state declares us equal, and moving into looking at how distribution of life chances operates and why those things are so hard to get at with our sort of state-sponsored change programs. Using the idea that laws are tactics in the arrangement of things, right? That law reform projects might be also able to use law reform projects tactically, right? As a way of organizing, not necessarily because law reform is our demand. Knowing that it always reproduces the same conditions. That liberation or emancipation, or however you're thinking about it, is a collective process, not a destination, right? So this is key in women of color feminism, that we have to have less hierarchy in our organizations, that we have a constant reflective practice that looks at who, even within our own politics, we're leaving out as threats and drains, right? So looking at the biopolitical level of our own organizing, the dangers of institutionalization, obviously in the nonprofit industrial complex analysis, the idea of putting most vulnerable people first, most effective people in leadership, and the most intersectionally vulnerable people at the center of our analysis, key to, of course, women of color feminism, and the notion that we need to do our work in ways that don't put anyone in exile, right? So resisting the prison industrial complex mentality in all of our work. I'll just finish saying that none of these questions and strategies are new, yet in the context of the war on terror, particularly this moment in capitalism, the crisis of mass imprisonment, and other features of neoliberalism, it's more clear than ever that these strategies based in legal equality demands often facilitate disparity, and that we must attend to technologies of stateness that are about mobilizing limited and fixed categories that produce maldistribution, both in the government and in our own movement organizations. I'm over time, so I'm going to leave the hopeful message for later.
Wow. Okay. Well, good morning. Buenos dias. How are you? It's a pleasure for me to be here joining you today. So I want to begin with many, many thanks to the faculty, the administration, the students who have done so much hard work to bring us all together. But I also want to thank all of you for making it a priority to be here this weekend, and in particular this morning. I'm glad to see that we have all been heeding Devon's opening advice that we pace ourselves and make it a point to do as much as we can. But in addition, I want to take a moment to thank the pioneering activist scholars that produced the knowledge to begin with across many disciplines and across many ages that allows us to now talk about the meaning, the substance, the trajectory of that knowledge for us today. And I just have to make two more quick points, two more quick observations before getting started. Kitty, who was sitting in this very chair 2 days ago, Mari, who was sitting in this very chair 2 days ago, commented, and then later Kitty and later Kim, what a beautiful room this is. And so I want you all to really, this is our last day together, take a moment to observe what Charles also said earlier this morning. It is an opportunity to capture images and to record memories that can sustain you when you are embedded alone in silos of vexation and oppression. Silos called home institutions. This room proves that none of us are alone in this struggle, even though we may be alone at different moments of assault. Intersectionality by design. During the past 2 days, we've examined the origins, the purposes, the trajectories, the representations of various intersectionalities. And now in this additional interdisciplinary panel, because they really kind of all have been, we turn specifically to the design of the concept and the discourses that we have been discussing across disciplines. So I want to emphasize at the outset that this panel, as much as all the others, and perhaps a little bit more because it focuses on design across disciplines, really is an opportunity for each of us to connect our own disciplinary work and perspective to developments and insights in other fields of knowledge. And to begin my own modest contribution to this panel and conversation, I will focus on the design of intersectionalities within the field known as law. I call these thoughts, what do I call these thoughts? I call these thoughts intersectionality at the intersections of legal doctrine, legal theory, and social life, towards political intersectionalities. So I read the title, which I normally don't even bother with, only because it helped me, in my own mind, frame what I'm trying to bring together, at a very high level of description because time is short, and the idea is to keep things short and then engage in conversation. So I'm going to, after a bit of background, focus on the intersectionalities in the title: doctrine, theory, political, within the field of law. And I encourage you to think of just about every sentence I will utter in the next 10 or 15 minutes as the tip of an iceberg. And then in conversation we can dig into whichever icebergs interest you more. Okay, so as background, the design of legal intersectionalities are, I think, in part, perhaps in large part, determined by the origins of formal legal education and by the architecture of its consolidation in the first half of the last century. Those processes pivoted in part on whether legal education, the field of knowledge known as law, was professional in nature or vocational in nature. Was it, like philosophy, committed to theory without constraint in the so-called real world? Or was it vocational, preparing technicians to practice this knowledge in the so-called real world? So law is perhaps not truly an academic discipline devoted and designed to produce knowledge. It is perhaps a practical discipline designed and dedicated to the production of practitioners as technicians. And as a result, we see doctrinal intersectionality, the part that reflects this history in terms of technicians, and theoretical intersectionality, the one that focuses on knowledge production as an academic discipline. So that's background. Focusing first on doctrinal intersectionality, it turns out that there are at least 9 categories of cases. I did a review of all the cases that I could find. And let me go through them real quickly. And this is a reflection of intersectionality as a collection of particular demographics. First, and the original, race and gender. Second, race, national origin, and gender. Third, race, national origin, and religion. Fourth, age and gender. Fifth, age and religion. Sixth, age and disability. Seventh, disability and gender. Eighth, race and sexual orientation. Ninth, gender and sexual orientation. So there are actual cases presenting claims of an intersectional nature framed as such by the plaintiffs and their lawyers, which then the judges had to do something with. And what they did with those cases is what I am calling the record of doctrinal intersectionality. That record consists of 2 stages in the process of adjudication. The first is the recognition, misrecognition, or non-recognition of intersectionality or intersectional claims. And in the second stage, within those that have some sort of recognition of the claim, the second stage is the administration or maladministration of the analysis of those claims. In the first stage of adjudication, the recognition, misrecognition, or non-recognition, there were 3 categories of results. In the first, the judges say, yes, we recognize the logic and coherence, and discuss why. Other times, they don't discuss it, but just go right to it. The case of Lamb versus Hawaii, which I'm going to use even though it's perhaps not the best articulation of yes with discussion, was decided by the Ninth Circuit in 1994. It's a very well-known example and oftentimes cited as a key example, I think in part because of the backstory, which is it involves a faculty search at the law school at the University of Hawaii at a time when both Mari Matsuda and Eric Yamamoto were there, participants both in that process and thus in the facts generating that case, as well as in the conceptualization of the claim, which I'm reading in between the lines of the district court opinion. If you read the district court opinion, it's very, very interesting. So, Mari, if you want to talk about that, I'd love to know a little bit about that backstory. Then there comes the example of no, we don't see the logic in that. We don't recognize intersectionality. And a case I will use to illustrate that is the A.G. Edwards case decided by the Eighth Circuit in 1989, involving race and sexual orientation of black men. The third category at this first stage is, yes, we recognize intersectionality, wink, wink, but not really. In other words, explicitly and formally we recognize it, but in practice we don't apply it. It's like formal equality. So those are the three ways in which that first stage play out. When it comes within those that say yes somehow, and then we get to the stage of application or administration, we get yes with substantive explanation, yes with no analysis, and yes, but not really. So this is just a very generic mapping, and to give some flesh to it, let me just read very briefly how doctrinal intersectionality is constructed by the judges in the text of their opinions. So the Ninth Circuit in Lamb says, the district court's justification for granting summary judgment was based on the defendant's favorable consideration of two other candidates for the position, one an Asian man, the other a white woman. In assessing the significance of these candidates, the lower court, seemed to view racism and sexism as separate and distinct elements amenable to almost mathematical treatment, so that evaluating discrimination against an Asian woman became a simple matter of performing two separate tasks, looking for racism alone and looking for sexism alone, with Asian men and white women as the corresponding model victims. We conclude the district court misconceived important legal principles. To begin with, even the law school's favorable treatment of other Asian women would not necessarily defeat Lamb's claim. At least equally significant is the error committed by the court in its separate treatment of race and sex discrimination. As other courts have recognized, where two bases for discrimination exist, they cannot be neatly reduced to distinct components. Like other subclasses, Asian women are subject to a set of stereotypes and assumptions shared neither by Asian men nor by white women. In consequence, they may be targeted for discrimination even in the absence of discrimination against Asian men or white women. So that's relatively clear. However, in the 1994 case decided the same year by the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, we have a very explicit juridical articulation of the very high human stakes involved. This is an age plus sex intersectional claim. If the defendant's argument is correct, that sex and age discrimination are not viable under Title VII, then count 2 of plaintiff's complaint, which presented a combined intersectional claim, can only be read as two separate claims, one for sex discrimination and another for age discrimination. And here are the stakes. And if forced to analyze these claims separately, it is clear that each would not survive. So, at the outset, we know that the judges know that the move they make towards the recognition or none of the claim as framed will produce fairly proximately a foreseeable result. It is a results determinative choice at the outset of the litigation, or at the outset of the judge's consideration of the claims that originate the litigation. The last quote is from the A.G. Edwards case, decided by the Eighth Circuit in 1989 involving a black man. And what's magnificent about this case, from a very perverse perspective, is that it is precisely this long, beginning here and ending here. And for those of you who can't see what takes place between here and here, it's 2 paragraphs. The first one is a 1-sentence paragraph. It says, Title VII does not prohibit discrimination against homosexuals. Period. And that's what you are, Mr. Black homosexual. The race claim is disappeared. So, we see how the judges acknowledge, react to, and then treat this knowledge. I don't have time to give you so much that this record provides, but for those of you who want leads, let me encourage you to look at 3 very thick cases. The Ruth case decided by the Southern District of Ohio in 91. The Renee case, which is fantabulous, decided by the Ninth Circuit in 02 en banc, meaning that all the judges participated, not just 3. And the Cascadia case from the District of Oregon in 07. All 3 shed a lot of light on the many permutations of the very simplistic mapping that I just did of the cases that create the record of doctrinal intersectionality. So, the intersectional record established by these cases strongly suggests that this kind of legal intersectionality is perhaps overly dependent on pre-existing doctrine itself. At the very least, it puts on display an extremely volatile dynamic in the recognition and administration of doctrinal intersectionality in the hands of North American judges. I have 1 minute left. So, I'm not going to linger on that anymore. In the second kind of intersectionality, theoretical intersectionality, the focus is on scholarship and what folks who produce scholarship do with the concept. Well, because Sumi provided a map in the opening plenary, I won't go into it. But for those of you who weren't there, she basically laid out 3, let's say, stages of of legal theoretical intersectionality. The original articulations, the testing applications, and then the erasing applications. Well, Sumi and others have already noted or indicated that the reach of or the limitations in this kind of intersectionality flow from the limitations or the perspectives or motivations of the individual authors, or, as Chandra emphasized yesterday, the very structural conditions of production. All I will add to this for the purpose of today's sessions is to observe that 1, the design or structure or architecture of theoretical legal intersectionality oftentimes reflects the specific configurations found in the 9 categories of identity produced by the cases. So the scholars work with the cases oftentimes, or they work with facts very similar to those reflected in the cases, but, number 2, theoretical, unlike doctrinal legal intersectionality, is not dependent on juridical or other constructions of intersectionality. And this second point, the lack of dependency, is a key element for the conclusion of this talk. So, as we have seen, when we juxtapose doctrinal and theoretical intersectionalities in the field of law, doctrinal intersectionality is dependent on law itself in the form of statutes, cases, etc. And, as these 3 cases that I read from illustrate, unless all the categories in the intersectional claim are already protected by pre-existing law or doctrine, then what the judges do, if they want, is to ignore the part of the claim that falls under a protected category, race, age, sex, and push the entire claim into the unprotected category, sexual orientation. This is part of what makes doctrinal intersectionality so volatile. On the other hand, we have seen that theoretical intersectionality is not similarly dependent on doctrinal contours. Theoretical intersectionality is therefore never blinded by law itself. Therefore, unsurprisingly, theoretical intersectionality is by far the more reliable, the more nuanced, and the more powerful of these two legal intersectionalities. The design of theoretical intersectionality, in other words, reflects social life rather than legal doctrine. And therefore, the design of theoretical intersectionality is different than that of doctrinal. Bottom line, theoretical intersectionality can and does go where no woman or man has been able to go under doctrinal intersectionality. This juxtaposition of theoretical and doctrinal intersectionalities in the field of law brings into focus several important insights for anti-subordination knowledge production and practices. One, the functions of intersectionality can and do shift depending on intellectual or social domains, and we can't take for granted that they travel or should travel in exactly the same way as they travel. Secondly, to the extent that theoretical intersectionality maps onto actual everyday life, then it effectively maps, or at least reflects, social realities. And if so, then the gaps between theoretical and doctrinal intersectionalities is a map of the dysfunctions of the legal system itself. It is a map of the dysfunctions or gaps in the doctrine of the law. It is a map of law's social irrelevance. This insight teaches that wherever a gap between theoretical and doctrinal intersectionalities can be located, a legal dysfunction has been identified. Whenever a gap exists, so does the need for reformatory intervention. This insight thus provides a tool for mapping and identifying injustice in many different settings. And by helping map injustice in very concrete and specific ways, this juxtaposition provides a blueprint for political intersectionalities. That is, critical coalitions that are formed and operated effectively to combat historical injustices. To conclude, ever since the emergence of critical outsider jurisprudence, critical race feminism, critical race theory, Asian American studies, Native American studies, etc., questions of identity, of sameness and difference, indeed Kim mentioned last night that had been part of her motivation for writing Demarginalizing, have been consistently salient in producing both the content and the design of critical outsider theorizing and action. Within this context, we have repudiated alliances based on interest convergences in favor of coalitions based on shared substantive commitments and agendas. This turn in favor of critical coalitions positions us to see how this juxtaposition of doctrinal and theoretical intersectionalities may help set the stage for political intersectionalities in legal theory, legal culture, and social practice. In other words, by helping us to put a critical spotlight on the gaps between doctrinal and theoretical intersectionalities in law, we map the locations in need of our interventions, of our work, of our research agendas. But research agendas in the form of activism, of praxis, that ultimately promote a broader and more powerful culture and ethic of critical coalitions over time. In other words, critical coalitions are a reflection of political intersectionalities as mapped by doctrinal and theoretical intersectionalities and their disjunctions. Thank you.
Okay, what I'd like to do first is give the panelists just a couple of minutes to either comment on things that they've heard, particularly if it is challenging to them, as well as to ask them to talk a little bit about where they see the commonalities in terms of intersectionality and the various disciplines that have been talked about. Who would like to start? A speechless Pam? Any of you?
I was just thinking we've gone so late. Maybe we should just throw things open.
Okay. Anyone? Everyone? Agreement? Okay. Why don't you line up at the mics, and we'll start taking your questions, and we'll go from there. Okay, let's start here.
I guess like Professor Mills, hopefully this doesn't get back to Cambridge or Ann Arbor either. So I have a question about disciplinary intersectionality, because both in college, law school, and graduate school, I've had to deal with bifurcation between a traditional discipline and a newer discipline that is much more self-conscious about power and politics. For instance, in college, in philosophy, you read Kant. In social studies, you read Foucault and Marx. And I think part of the problem, though, is that for the traditional discipline, you're very lonely, but you get prestige and respect. That's where the tenure lines are. That's where the money is. And if you are in sort of the newer discipline, then you are with fellow travelers, but you may not get tenure, you may not get a job, no one respects you, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, in terms of our careers, sort of for the young'uns here, how do you choose in terms of where do you put your time? What program do you decide to be in? Do you radicalize the traditional program, or do you try to keep the radical edges of the self-consciously program?
No, absolutely. That's a real problem. I mean, it's easy to say the stuff I'm saying. I mean, Jesus Christ, I have tenure. I mean, I even have an endowed share. But I mean, if you're on the market, that's a different story, sure. What I used to tell people to do is follow a kind of two-track policy, in the sense that it's imperative that you master the mainstream stuff. It's imperative both instrumentally in terms of being able to hold up your own end in a job interview, in terms of not looking like a deer in the headlights when you're challenged at conferences. And it's also imperative intrinsically in that you'll be a better scholar in your particular profession if you know both the mainstream stuff and the radical stuff. But insofar as you are committed to social change, insofar as you do see the problems, with mainstream framings of things, I think you also need to pursue, those kinds of subjects, or the subjects that this conference is, centered on. How do you do it in terms of your particular dissertation? That wouldn't apply to law school, but I mean, the areas that do have dissertations, that becomes more problematic. I mean, what are you going to work on? That stuff you're going to have to sort of, decide for yourself in terms of job prospects, in terms of what your supervisor is an expert in. But what people need to remember is this, in terms of where I think, your question is particularly coming from. You can do mainstream stuff and raise questions even within a mainstream framework. This is what I've been trying to do, in a sense, in my own work. I'm engaging with social contract theory, which is very mainstream, and I'm trying to introduce radical questions within that framework. So the idea is to sort of master both, and then it sounds so crass. Then once you've gotten tenure and they can't do anything to you, then you sort of come out of the closet, or come out of the phone booth. I mean, of course, they don't have phone booths. And yet another dated metaphor. You come out of the appropriate thing that has been hiding your radical identity, and you say, hey, actually, I don't think this stuff is... Okay, I'm not saying you go all the way with that, but it does mean that you need to have in your skill set all those things that they're going to be asking you, because in a sense, the burden is greater on you than for somebody who's doing a straight mainstream thing, because the mainstream person doesn't need to know the radical stuff at all, because they're never going to engage with that, whereas you need to do both. So I guess that's the safest answer. Make sure that you master both.
Great, thank you. You?
This is for Dr. McCall. First, I just wanted to say that I'm a social epidemiologist, and when I read your paper that was in Science, I think it was, a few years back on methods, I was just so glad because I've been interested in intersectionality since Professor Crenshaw wrote her paper in the late 80s, but being in quantitative sciences, I've been trying to do it myself, but not feeling very successful. So I was really pleased to see your paper, which forefronted quantitative approaches to addressing intersectionality. So related to that, I have a comment and then a question. So if I know you didn't talk about praxis, but if we do think about how method, about the consequences of method for praxis, so the consequences of our research, quantitative research, for being taken up on behalf of making social change to disrupt hierarchies of power, then I think I like the idea of pathologizing the rich, but I think that by focusing on pathologizing the rich white males, that we ignore the hierarchies and the myriad ways in which the majority of us who are not rich white males maintain social hierarchies. And so I think that for social change, the real problem is not so much that the vast majority of the public doesn't see that their positioning is harmed by rich white males. What stops mass social movement is that the majority of us are fighting to maintain our relatively small positions of privilege and power that do also cause harms to other people. And so I would argue that we need to pathologize power and privilege along the entire social hierarchy. And then my question is related to, if we think about social positioning and kind of complex social positioning that would be that we would think about if we were using an intersectionality theoretical frame, how might we study quantitatively structural determinants of social positioning?
That's a big one.
Thanks. That's a lot to consider. I guess in terms of the first part of your question, I think that's an empirical question, actually, and I think that's partly what I've been trying to do, is that we make a lot of assumptions about what people think. And the work that I'm doing right now is on what Americans think about income inequality. And guess what? We've never asked them. We have so few questions on their beliefs about income inequality that we don't really know very much about that. And I've looked at the very few that do exist. It's just never been an issue that survey researchers have thought important to ask about. And so I guess I would just say, I don't want to dodge the question, but sometimes it's really important to really know what it is that we're talking about and try to document it. And the sort of idea of American public opinion or Americans being complicit, of course there are aspects of that are absolutely true, but I think there are other aspects in which they have challenging views that are not typically heard by either journalists or politicians or other kinds of advocates. And I guess that's what I'm trying to do, is actually shift the discussion to understanding sort of empirically, what it is that people believe and how that hooks up to a politics of change in ways that we're really not we haven't expected before. So that's just how I'm gonna, and I do think it's a complicated thing, and on different dimensions you're going to get different sorts of expressions of power and privilege and subordination. So I will leave it at that. In terms of the structural determinants, you could say that a good 50%, if not all, of social science is sort of aimed at trying to document the structural determinants of inequality. That's a major agenda for social science research, and it can be done in so many different ways. And in the interest of time, I think I'm just gonna leave it there.
Thank you. Here.
Yeah, thanks. My question is actually strikingly similar to the first question, but I am not in a multidisciplinary position. I'm in just one discipline that has told me I am a philosopher, a sociologist, and a social worker. And so being in this discipline and ascribing to mainstream methods would be to utilize a reductionist intersectional approach. So when using the methods of your field and straddling, quote unquote, this, this radical approach or whatever, and still trying to stay in your field, do you have any strategies for kind of pushing the agenda in the field but not ascribing to mainstream methods? I mean, because doing so would be to basically just use variables, use race, class, gender, and such as demographic variables.
What's your
It is
discipline?
kind of, what is my field?
Yeah.
Social psychology.
Okay.
I was dodging that part.
I know, but it makes it harder to answer.
Thank you.
I can answer.
Again, I think there's fabulous research. Philip Atiba's presentation last night, for one, and I know a number of others in social psychology, Jen Richardson at Northwestern, who I know, who are doing incredible research, but using, and I just want to put into that category qualitative researchers. There's no what's the word, guarantee that qualitative research is going to be any less reductive or more emancipatory than quantitative research. And I think we have to put those divides aside and say, what is our goal? What is our purpose? What is our research question? What are the what does the political situation demand that we do? And I don't see any reason why any method cannot be used in a way that furthers those kinds of goals. And we can list many examples of that. So I mean, I think the law is one example. It can be incredibly, it can reproduce the status quo, and it absolutely does do that. But at the same time, you don't throw it out. You look at the gaps and you see where there is potential. And I'm sure some of us are more optimistic than others. But recognizing the harms and the reproduction of oppression on the one hand, but also trying to expose the gaps, the fissures, the ways in which you can make a difference.
I just want to quickly say I agree, because as a psychologist and one who is actually also a clinician but trained in social psychology, I think it's very accommodating, So, okay.
Thank you so much for this lovely panel, and I really appreciate the interdisciplinarity that was represented here and at the conference. In the spirit of interdisciplinary theories and thinking about the concepts that were highlighted here in terms of governmentality, biopolitics, anti-subordination, thinking about radical critiques in a dominant discipline, I'm wondering what the panelists have directed everyone who'd like to contribute. Think about the room within intersectionality, now that is relatively established after these decades, for kind of investigating its humanist kind of foundation. So I still see intersectionality as being, despite its critique of liberalism, still not engaging with kind of the post-humanist studies that are coming out of interdisciplinary models, to thinking about what are the limits in our critical thinking and our critical inquiries when we retain a humanist focus. And so if we take a theory like liberalism, part of what's been contested about liberalism is its humanist design through Western thought, and that as much as when we criticize kind of theories of recognition, theories of inclusion, like we'll never get liberalism as the critique to do what it's purporting to do in terms of universal justice, universal equality, because it's kind of a difference hostile theory. And one of those differences that it can't accommodate is the idea of the non-human, the idea of the subhuman, and that's already always perpetuated in the theory. So I'm just wondering if the panelists see this as a moment to maybe, think about the humanist paradigms, think about the lovely kind of image at the top on our brochures and on our pamphlets. Should there be something about the humanist parameters under which my understanding of intersectionality operates? Thank you.
Can I do one thing, because I want to make sure we get all the questions in? Can we actually have the other two questions and then, because otherwise we won't make it. Can I have your questions and then we'll have the panel discuss them?
I'm Margaret Montoya from the University of New Mexico, and I have a joint appointment in law and medicine. So I want to just make a short comment and then ask a question about epistemologies, disciplines, and discourse. One of the things that happened in medicine was that the Institute of Medicine went to Congress in the late 1980s and asked the question, or asked Congress to study the question, how does racism make us sick? And so what happened was that Congress, in fact, began what is now decades long of studies to answer that question. And we now have the tools of racial and health disparities, which is driving a number of things in health reform, including the creation of community medicine, community health clinics, but it's also driving the creation of a more diverse group of primary care providers. Much of it very delayed, but at least there is a linking of policy to analysis. And certainly in medicine, I don't think that they have the tools of the theoretical interdisciplinarity, and it's impoverished by that. But I think that we are impoverished in that we have never done an analysis that links justice with racism, that there are justice disparities, and that Congress should have studied it, and that we should have a language that really allows us to be doing policy interventions around social determinants. And so I just wanted to make that point, that I think that there are places where we haven't built the bridges that would accelerate the social change.
Thank you. Last one?
I'm Lisa Ruckty, and thank you so much for your panel today. I'm a sociologist also, so my question is for Dr. McCall. I'm wondering, I'm a qualitative researcher, I'm an ethnographer, so I really appreciated what you said about there's no guarantee. I agree. And qualitative research tries to be very rigorous in the same ways that quantitative research does. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts about operationalizing identity categories. When in your second approach, when we are looking at when you talked about the book that your colleague is going to be releasing, that second approach looking at how different phenomenon or different value changes according to the intersection, I'm looking at care and how that changes, and not just looking at the identities of my participants, but really looking at social ideologies. And I worry about how I operationalize race and nationality, even though it comes from my participants. So, for example, I'm operationalizing nationality as accent, or race perhaps as skin tone. But I worry about those limitations, and I'm wondering if you have come across similar things and how you've handled that. Thank you.
Okay, we've got two questions on the table, so let's see who wants to answer the first. Dean?
I'll just address the question about humanism. I think that I'm really glad you brought it up, and it made me think of, I was just reading Andrea Smith's essay recently. It's called something like American Studies Without America, or Without the U.S. I can't remember the exact title of it. And there's 2 points she makes in it. One thing she says is that aspiring to humanity is always already a racial project. And then she also quotes Luana Ross saying that genocide has never been illegal in the United States. And to me, those two intersecting points are kind of what I'm trying to get across, which is that that rather than aspiring to humanity, we can investigate sort of what constitutes the category of the human, and how legal equality frameworks are often co-constitutive with that idea. And that analysis to me is not only an analysis to do of sort of like the legal field, but also of our own activist resistance formations, and an analysis to do of disciplines in our universities, et cetera. So sort of the governance questions and the use for me of the biopolitics framework is that it allows us to look at how that project always incorporates state racism, right? Always includes state racism, always based on state racism. And to me, that gives us sort of this impossible problem, the fact that we're always going to fail to be fully inclusive because state racism is essential to sort of the setup. And so that's, to me, why women of color feminism and women of color feminist praxis especially is so essential. And I meant to talk today, but I ran out of time, about Sheila Sandoval's Methodologies of the Oppressed and her suggestion that U.S. third world feminism uses the differential as its mode of sort of ideological critique. And I feel like that piece is really, really helpful for trying to think about not making truth claims based on access to the human category in our work because we understand the costs and the sort of endless limitations of that. But I think that's very, not really being done in law. So it's very hard to do in the context of law because you have to do what I think Frank was suggesting, which is recognize the total irrelevance of the legal framework to do that. And I just want to say one other thing about the people who are asking as junior scholars. I'm also obviously an untenured junior scholar, and I think that we have to remember that academia really is here to co-opt and neutralize activists. And so if we really take that seriously, then every single incentive towards tenure or towards elite, recognition of any kind, whether it's publish your work where no one will read it, write about something that you don't care about, use methods that you know are totally messed up, whatever it is, don't spend time on student activism, supporting your students instead, and critiquing the university. Instead, spend it all keeping your head down, and then wait for later. I think that's a very dangerous thing that we're told. And so I just want to say that I think that, that, and I don't think that's what people who founded critical race theory were doing. I don't think that's who the radical and sort of transformative theorists who we admire, I think they took a lot of risks. And so I think we have to be really thoughtful about that and think about whether or not we really want a job that requires that of us and sort of what that means. And I really recommend, it's been really helpful to me to read this article by Fred Moten called The Undercommons of the University. So anyway, it's a really great article. It might be useful to some of you too.
Okay, Dr. McCall.
Do you address the okay. I think that's a tough question. It's exactly the kind of where are you? There you are. That's exactly the reason why, in a sense, you're doing the research you're doing is to come up with the answer to that question. And I think that's the process that we go through when we do research. When it's exactly at those moments when we don't know what to do, that we should continue doing them and do things that are unexpected, actually, and make the contributions that are needed to be made when we run into those roadblocks. So I don't know if that's another sort of inspired thought, but I wouldn't want to give I don't think there is a right answer to that question, and lots of questions of the kind of research that people are doing here, the sort of cutting edge research.
Thank you. Dr. Valdez, before we close, any last comments?
Thank you all. Thank you all.
I think he said it well for us. All right, folks, thank you very much. Lunch is going to be where it was yesterday, so if you just go out the door and turn that way, you will find lunch. And thank you.
I think lost means working.